Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we are piecing block number 9, our house block. And this is going to be a lot of pieces, but with careful piecing and keeping everything kind of organized and under control, it's going to be a lot of fun to put together. So let's get started. So here's our block, and what I really want to emphasize to you is the importance of keeping track of everything and kind of laying everything out block by block. I wouldn't advise trying to piece all 4 of them at once. It can get a little confusing. We've got a lot of little pieces in here. So let's go one block at a time. That's my best advice for you. And we're going to work in sections. We're going to start with this roof section, then do the sky section, and then the house section, kind of the center portion of the house, and then finish it off with 2 strips on the sides and a strip on the bottom, and that will finish it up so it's ready to quilt. So let's get started. Here are the sections that we need for our roof. We need a half square triangle, and this is just a square stitched on the diagonal 2 lines in order to create 2 half square triangles. And if you are confused by this at all, please go check out block number 6, the pinwheel block, and get a little review of how to prepare your half square triangles. So in order to cut these apart, all I'm going to do is take a pair of scissors and cut right on that diagonal line. This is exactly the way we learned the last time. You're just going to cut them apart and you end up with 2 half square triangles. Perfect for these little sections, these little diagonals on the house. Okay, so take your half square triangles. This is the same way we did before. Press open the seams with your fingers, finger press them open, and then take them to your ironing board and press them nice and flat. Same thing for the other one. And then you're going to trim them down to the proper size. Trim them down to 2.5 inches. And this is what it's going to look like when you're done with that. You have 2 half square triangles, and then you've also got this middle piece. This is piece number Y, or letter Y I should say. So we've got this arrangement. Okay, so now we're going to simply place 1 half square triangle on top of the center square, on top of that Y piece, and we're going to stitch this with a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so just slide it under your foot, make sure everything's in good alignment, and stitch through. Sometimes if I see things are off just a little at the bottom, I can just kind of pick it up and reposition. That works great. And now I'm going to stitch off onto a scrap charger to keep all my threads in nice and clean. Nothing's going to get sucked down in the machine with that little piece of fabric going through. Okay, I don't need to stop and press right now. Instead, I need to just grab that other half square triangle and butt it up here. Place that on top. Ooh, got some scuzz. And stitch through. Now I always like to start where the seam allowance is kind of bulky. I don't really like to start down here because I find if I stitch down into it I'll hit that seam allowance and kind of go funny. So I'm just going to flip this over and make sure to start up here where that seam allowance is more bulky on that half square triangle. I find that that really helps to keep things even and match up properly. So just slide it under the foot right next to the needle and stitch down. Okay, so there's our roof section. You want to finger press these seam allowances open. Give them a nice little press. Take them to your iron and press everything nice and open. Set this piece aside. We'll use it again in a little while. Okay, so now it's time to start our roof section. We've got piece letters T on both sides, letter W to the top, the skinny long piece, and X is this little tiny square. So what you're going to do is simply place X on top of W, align this bottom edge, and go ahead and stitch that seam and press that seam allowance open. Then you're simply going to piece this strip to the 2 T's on either side. And here's what this is going to look like after you get it finished. You can see it shrinks quite a bit because of all the seam allowances. but we end up with this little 1/2 inch wide little square here. Now don't worry, I know that this looks like a little square. The reason is we haven't stitched the seam allowance on the bottom yet. This is going to come out just perfect. So let's set this section aside and work on the next step. The next step is this part of the house. Okay, so we're ready to start the center house section. And in order to get started, what I like to do is go on ahead and piece these center areas. So we've got piece letter G and piece letter R, and we're simply going to lay R on top of G, go on ahead and stitch this with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance and press it open, and you'll end up with your RG piece, this little section. Then you want to do the same thing with these pieces, and this one was the one I had a little trouble with. I kept getting it flipped. And to be honest, it really doesn't matter if you flip it. What will end up happening is the window will just kind of go up a little bit, and it won't be in line with the door. So it's not the end of the world if you did that. I kind of did. I had to rip it out. So it's one of those things that's not the end of the world, so don't worry about it too much. What you'll do is place your piece. This is another R piece, H and P. You're going to place R on top of H, stitch that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, going ahead and flip your P piece up and stitch that as well. Press all those seam allowances open and you'll have a strip that looks like this. So now we've got these 2 strip units, and then we've got J, K, and K. So this is how I kind of got flipped around. I actually took this piece and I kind of flipped it upside down when I stitched it, so it's pretty easy to do. So here's how I kind of put all of this together. Going ahead and place this outer side, that J piece on top of the RG piece, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch this with a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'll come back to these pieces and stitch them next. It's a good way to keep everything in alignment. Okay, let's go stitch. Okay, so just slide the piece under the foot. The nice thing about this, there's not a lot of matching in this block. I'm not trying to match some seam perfectly. These are just basically a strip unit coming together with a strip, a pieced unit. So it's really just, you're wanting the sides to match up and the length to match up. That's pretty much it. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't, and there's no seams. So it's kind of a nice block to get away with if your piecing isn't completely perfect yet. It comes with time. Just remember that. Piecing always, the experience of piecing always comes with time and practice. So here's what this is going to look like. Just give it a little finger press and it's going to look just fine. So placing this piece here, we pretty much just got this section to finish. And what I'm going to do is simply place the K on one side over that piece unit. Go on ahead and take this to the machine and stitch it the exact same way. Press that seam allowance open. Actually, you can kind of wait on pressing that seam allowance. You can go on ahead and stitch this side too, and then take it to your ironing board and press all of that at one time. Okay, so here's the 2 sections ready to go. I'm going to layer this section on top, and here's one thing to just kind of keep in mind. You want to make sure that this little square, the same size as your window basically, that needs to be on the bottom. If you flip it, it's going to be like this, and like I said, your window is just going to appear just a little further up on the wall. It's not the end of the world, but I kind of like it better that way, so that's the way I'm going to put it together. So just layer this section on top of the other and stitch that, get it nicely aligned, and stitch it with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll be done with this section. So here's the house section. We're going to top that with the roof section and then the sky section. So let's fold down the roof and go ahead and stitch it to the house section. And in this situation, we do have a seam to match. There is a seam line running up here next to the door, coming up. This should match up with the seam between the half square triangle and that middle square. So just want to carefully line that up. And the nice thing is, I mean, it is all the same color. It's all, that fabric A color. I'm using blue. So even if you don't match the seam, it's not the end of the world. you know, no one's going to really be able to see it. And we're going to cover this up with quilting too. So if this doesn't hit perfectly, please don't obsess about it. It's not that big of a deal. I'm going to take this to the machine and stitch it. We are running through a pretty bulky spot right here at the beginning. So it might be a good idea if you want to put a pen right there. I'm going to place a pen just where I'm matching the seam, right in the seam allowance right there. But I like to get started right there on that kind of bulky spot, and I just lift up my presser foot. If I start it back here, kind of feeding it into the machine from the tip of the presser foot, oftentimes I find it kind of squishes the fabric downward. So if you lift the presser foot, and I've got a knee lifter, but you can always reach your hand back in here and lift the presser foot and take the piece all the way to the needle. The needle's in the down position, and I'm just taking the piece all the way. So the first stitch that the needle takes is going to be onto this fabric. That really makes a difference. It doesn't have a chance to squish it forward. It doesn't have a chance to slide on you. That's really helpful. Try and take this pen out before I hit it. So long as you stitch slowly enough, it really doesn't matter if you stitch over your pens. I've been doing it for years. I know everybody has horror stories about stitching over pens, but it's one of those things that I still forget and do. It's one of those habits from sewing garments. I got into a bad habit of stitching over pens. Okay, coming to the end. This is a tricky spot. It's going to want to pull forward on you. We've got a seam allowance here, so just be kind of gentle with it. You might want to even lift your presser foot a little bit to kind of get it up on top of that bulky seam allowance and stitch down. And looking at it, opening it up, you can see that this matches very nicely, but even if it didn't, it really wouldn't be the end of the world. It looks good though. Alright, so there's the center part of the house. Now we're going to just simply flip over the sky section. There's nothing to match here. It's wonderful. We're just going to simply flip it, line up these sides, line up the edge, and stitch it. Okay, so there is that final seam stitched for our center of our block. You can see how that came together. You do want to be gentle with these seam allowances. Finger press them open. I know I'm nailing that into your heads, but I really want to emphasize it's important to press everything open. We do have a little bit of bulk, especially around these half square triangles. Grab a pair of scissors and just carefully clip out, just like what we did with the pinwheel. Just carefully clip out little bits. Don't clip any stitching, of course, but that's going to help reduce that bulk and make that just a little bit easier to stitch over when we're quilting. We're just going for reduction so our needle doesn't hit like 6 layers at once. Trust me, it's not pretty when that happens. Just finger press that open. Now, what if something didn't quite work with this roof? Where would we see it? Well, we'd more than likely see it right here at this seam where the point of these half square triangles kind of hit the sky. You'd kind of see maybe a blunted point on the triangle, something like that. But here's the thing, this is a roof, so even if your triangle comes up here and is kind of cut off or blunted or something, it's not going to matter because it's just going to fit in with this blue piece. It's going to look great. And just so you know why that would have happened, if you see something like that, if you see kind of a blunted triangle look, not really a sharp crisp point, it's probably something in your construction of the half square triangle. Whenever you press the half square triangle open and then you trimmed it up to 2.5 inches, something might have been a little off. You might not have had that diagonal line perfectly squared up as you were trimming, and that's what happened. And then of course it compounds. If the cutting, if the piece, the first piecing and the cutting, trimming it down, aren't right, then it will compound into the next piecing, piecing it into the roof section. So just keep that in mind. It's not a mystery. There is always a reason why something doesn't quite work out perfectly. So I'm just kind of finger pressing this open just generally, and then I'm going to go hit it with my iron, and we're going to finish off the block adding strips to the 2 sides and a strip along the bottom. Okay, so here we go. House is ready to piece with 2 strips on the sides. These are letter L, and so all you do is simply layer 1 on one side, stitch that seam, layer 1 on the other side, stitch that seam, press both seam allowances open, and your block will come together. And then you'll notice that this piece, this M, is a little longer. I had you cut it to 10.5, and there's a very good reason for that. As you're piecing, sometimes things end up wider or bigger. It's nice to cut a long strip like this a little longer and have some excess, and you can trim that excess if you need to. Like right here, I've just got a little bit of excess on the side. It's far better to cut big and piece big, piece a piece too big, like in this situation right on the edge, and then trim it up, rather than trying to take a 10-inch strip, piece it on here, and let's say it maybe didn't quite fit, and stretching it till it fit. You know who you are. I used to do this too. You'll end up with a ripple. You'll end up contorting your fabric basically if you do that. So it's easier, cut longer, stitch it on, and then trim it up. But you know, this is the outer edge of our block. We just have this outer edge so we have something to hang on to while quilting. So the edges don't really matter. We're going to be quilting inside of this 8 inches, just the 8-inch square. So keep that in mind. So that's it for our house block. This is honestly one of my favorite blocks in this quilt because it's so cheerful and fun. I love that it's a beautiful block and it looks like a house, but at the same time there's not that need for extreme precision. If your piecing skills are still kind of a struggle for you, if you really love free motion quilting so much more and piecing's kind of like, oh, I don't really want to bother with that, you know, it's one of those things you can put these together, and even if they're a little wonky, even if you've got, you know, the roof is doing something funny with those triangles, it's going to look great. It's going to be fine, and perfection is not the point anyway. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and learn how to piece this beautiful block as well as 12 others, and get 42 full-size quilting guides so you know how to quilt everything in many different beautiful ways. Find that pattern at leahday.com and join us as we learn piecing and free motion quilting in 2014. Until next time, let's go quilt.